All right, welcome NFL fans, football fans in general, to a Tuesday episode of the Call Sheet Daily podcast here at the Fans First Sports Network. I'm your host, Kevin Smith. It is a couple days removed now from the draft. I think the dust is settled on that. Got a chance to really assess what went down. And I really want to base this episode upon what I think is a very interesting subject in relation to the draft, the notion of value. What does that term mean as it applies to the draft? And how do teams determine whether or not they got good value in the draft? And to join me for that conversation is the head honcho here at Fans First, the CEO, Ken Wisnefski. Welcome aboard, Ken.
Thanks for having me. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, man. I'm doing great. And I wanted to bring Ken on because he is a very successful businessman, started multiple businesses, knows an awful lot about investing capital and resources into a business, and what do you need to get in return for that? And so Ken's a great one to talk about this idea of value. So before we dive into that conversation, let's define that term, right? What are we talking about? When we talk about value in the NFL draft, Ken, what are we getting at?
Well, I mean, I think probably one of the things that you kind of hear so much nowadays from, during the draft or even during, free agency, you'll hear more and more people say, well, the NFL is a business, right? And we have to make business decisions. We've got to part ways with certain players because it's a business. So when you look at kind of the value specifically to the draft, where you're actually making those picks and the expectation that really comes along with that pick. So a first round pick, the value there has to be that this is going to be someone who is an impact player on your team. This is someone who's going to be a starter in the short term. This is someone who's going to be able to provide a lot of overall value and impact to the team. When you get into the later rounds, the value and what that value is, in my opinion, really kind of decreases, right? So if you're a 6th or 7th round pick, your value expectation is that you're going to be able to be rostered. You are maybe a backup. You're maybe playing special teams. You're someone who can add a roster spot to offset some of the costs for some of your higher priced players, and you could fill in when needed, and you're someone that's able to kind of be part of the team. But the expectations for a 6th or 7th rounder as far as value are much different than a first rounder. And this is why the Tom Brady's and the Brock Purdy's that are drafted real late in the draft are talked about so much, because their expectation and their value that was put on them to begin with was that they were just going to be guys that were on the team. They were part of the team. They were a backup. They were someone whose low cost structure enabled them to have other superstars in the salary cap. And then when you've got somebody like a Brady, who obviously is probably the biggest example of someone who was, his value was obviously not what it really turned out to be. Those stories are always talked about so much because they far outweigh the value of what they originally were able to do or thought they were able to do because they were drafted so low.
Right. And I think the opposite is true. You get the Bradys and the Purdys and guys like that at the back end who exceed their expected value. And then you get guys taken in the first round who might actually wind up being decent football players, but because they're first round picks, they don't live up to that pedigree. I think back to the Steelers. They had a draft pick a few years back named Terrell Edmonds, a safety, who turned out to be a pretty good player. He started for 4 years in Pittsburgh, but he was a first-round pick, and he never excelled. He never played at an elite level. Or here's a better example that you'll remember: the Eagles and Mike Mamula.
Yeah.
Right? Mike Mamula was not a bad football player for the Philadelphia Eagles, but what was he taking? Like 10th overall, something like that.
He was never a standout on a team that had guys that were really good players at that point. So you're right. It's your expectation as a first round pick is that you're essentially going to be a superstar. You're going to be someone who's really, really making a lot of noise on that team. And when you're, average or maybe slightly above average, you're viewed as a bust. If Mamula had been a 6th round pick, it would have been heralded as a great draft pick, because he had, they were able to get value from him and they were able to use him. But it's really about your position in the draft. And That's how much, when we talk about value, right? That's how much stock is put into the draft nowadays. How much, teams really rely on the draft to really be able to build their teams. And really, being smart about it is the thing that I really look at it. And we talked about the Eagles a little bit, but they know that they've got to try to lock up some of those key players that they've drafted over the past couple of years. Jalen Carter being the one that's probably the biggest name out there. They know that he's going to command a huge compensation when he's due. So unfortunately for the Eagles, right, you can't have all these superstars on your team that they all want to get paid. So you need to be able to draft smartly and have guys that are on these rookie contracts to really be able to make things so you can make it all fit under the salary cap. And I think that's why you look at the Eagles draft this year, and the last couple drafts for the Eagles have had a lot of splashy names and some really good kind of high profile picks, guys that fell like Jalen Carter or Nolan Smith. But this year, you right, some people would say I was kind of blah, but from the Eagles perspective, they feel they got a lot of value. They got players that they can put into the mix that are going to be able to offset some of the costs that these players have really are really going to need for them to be able to retain them.
Yeah. You use the term stock in the comments you were making. I mean, stock is an investment. The draft is an investment. In your business experience, again, I mentioned at the beginning of the show, you've built up several very successful companies. What have you learned about the calculations that you have to make while investing, and how could that apply really to the NFL draft? What is your thought process about making an investment? What do you need to get in return in order for that investment to be worth it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things you kind of look at is, you hear more and more, teams when they say, oh, such and such a team went with the safe pick. They went with something that was kind of safe, a player that maybe didn't have as much of the big name, maybe doesn't have as high of an upside, but that someone they felt pretty secure with, that they knew could play and was going to be a solid player. And I think that that's one of the things when you look at investing in personnel, right? Investing in staff, investing in people, you've got to look at kind of where that's at. And, I think one of the best examples, and Kevin, I know you and I have talked good about him, was Milroe from Alabama, right? And you had told me the one time, hey, if you look at this guy's top 5 plays that he had, the guy would be the number 1 pick. But if you look at his bottom 5 plays, the guy's probably an undrafted free agent. He ran freakishly fast. I'm sure he would have ended up on some team. But this is why you look at someone like that. He's got high upside, really high upside. But he also comes with the notion that maybe he's just not going to translate, or he's not going to be able to kind of learn the system. So when you look at that stock, I think him going in the 3rd round, I kind of saw him as a 3rd or 4th round draft pick. We talk about value. I think he has value at that level, where he could eventually be a guy that we come back and say, well, he should have been the number 1 quarterback picked in this draft. Or we could say, hey, he was a guy who just never really translated to the NFL.
It's interesting because we're going to get to quarterbacks in a minute. They seem to be so important to the game right now that they're almost being graded on a different scale than everybody else. But let's talk about some non-quarterbacks. What are some things that we just saw in the draft over the weekend that you think may provide good value to some of the teams based upon the production that they're likely to get from those players?
Yeah, non-quarterback wise, I think you look at, one of the things that I think was an interesting move was the Jaguars moving up to get Travis Hunter. I think the Jaguars are a team right now that struggling to kind of, increase their fan base. They've, it seems like they kind of reach these pinnacles where they're on the cusp of Super Bowl, and then they just kind of drop off, and they're kind of struggling a little bit right now, trying to find an identity, and trading up to get the Heisman Trophy winner, a guy who's got a lot of kind of a lot of press around him, I thought was the type of splashy move that the Jaguars needed to make right now to just get their name in the conversation, right? I mean, if the Jaguars drafted an offensive lineman, which again, don't get me wrong, is a key part to success, I don't think it would have gotten the type of buzz, and they needed some buzz. So I think that was an example of something that, back to the NFL being a business, right? As a business, they needed a splashy pick. They needed that more than they needed something that wasn't as splashy. But when you look at kind of other players, like I thought one that was a great pick was, the Steelers with picking, Sawyer. I think he's a guy that could really step in and help them quite a bit immediately. And value, when you look at value, the fact that Will Johnson dropped so far in the draft and the Cardinals got him, there's a guy that, was probably a top 10 pick if he was healthy. And when you look at the injuries he had, turf toe and, some other things, kept him out a good amount this year. But, to me, they weren't injuries that I felt were the type of things that were, potentially, could completely derail his career. So I thought that was a really good pick. And that's where, you kind of look at these guys that the Eagles have made a killing on these guys that have dropped because of the fact they had something that, people kind of counted against them. And, so I thought, the Will Johnson pick was a pretty smart pick by Arizona.
Yeah, there were some people that had him going in the top 10.
Yep.
And then he slides out of there. I thought, you're probably not going to like hearing this as an Eagles fan, but I thought the Giants did a really good job in terms of this conversation about value. Abdul Carter, a lot of people thought he was the best football player in the entire draft. And now they pick him at 3, so it's not exactly like he slid. But when you can get the best player in the draft and you're not picking first overall, that feels like a great investment. And he's a great scheme fit for what they want to do. And then a couple rounds later, they got Cam Scadaboo, the running back from Arizona State. They got him in the 4th round. He's a guy that if you put him in the right role, could be a really effective back. And we've seen the value of the running back position in recent years. I don't want to say necessarily decrease because you still get your high-end backs. I mean, we've seen some great first-round picks. Saquon Barkley, obviously. Jahmyr Gibbs was a good first-round pick. Bijan Robinson. I think Genty's going to be an excellent back. But most teams now are really finding good running back value, productive running backs in the 3rd, 4th, 5th rounds. I think Scadaboo might be that kind of guy for the Giants.
I thought the Giants had a great draft. Even though I'm not, I'm not that high on Jackson Dart. I thought the fact that they used some of their capital to move up to get him was kind of the right approach. They didn't use their only 1st round pick to kind of go get him. The Abdul Carter, I thought to myself when the Giants were picking at 3, they were in the, probably one of the easiest positions in this particular draft because, it was Cam Ward, Hunter, Abdul Carter were kind of the consensus top 3 picks. So the Giants didn't have a lot of thinking. If Abdul Carter went 2 to whether the Browns stayed in that spot and Hunter fell to him, that would have been a good pick. If Cam Ward fell all the way to 3, hard not to take him with the 3rd pick. So, I thought the Giants had kind of an easy first pick there at 3, where nobody could really argue with it. And obviously, I have some concerns about Abdul Carter's size, but I definitely think he's a good player. And I thought the Giants had a great draft, and I thought your Steelers had a really good draft. I thought the Steelers, really kind of intelligently kind of plugged a lot of holes and kind of really made some good picks along the way. I'd say that, I thought that the sight on scene, right? And at this point, it's everybody just taking a guess, but I thought the Giants and the Steelers had 2 of the better overall drafts this year. Although the Giants have definitely complicated their life with as many quarterbacks as they have and, the ones that they do have. So, but beyond that, I think that their draft was pretty solid.
You brought up Jackson Dart, and I want to talk about quarterbacks. One thing the Giants didn't do was force a quarterback at the top of the draft. And that's in the last couple of years, the top of the draft has been really quarterback heavy. And some of those teams have kind of forced them. Now, a lot of people think Carolina forced that Bryce Young pick. They traded a mountain of resources to get him. And he ended last year on a high note, and it may turn out to be okay, but the early returns were bad. Indianapolis spent the 4th overall pick on Anthony Richardson. I mean, that doesn't look like that's going to work out. And there were a ton of red flags about Anthony Richardson coming out of college. He'd only started 12 games. His completion percentage in college was like 54%, which is coming out of college. That's terrible. So they were so desperate, though, for a quarterback that it feels like they reached. The Giants didn't do that. They took a different approach. So let's talk about this real quick. What are we learning about quarterback value, or at least in this draft? What did we learn about the fact that, hey, Cam Ward was unquestionably the best QB. He went number 1, but then everybody else was willing to wait. What did that tell you about the quarterback value in this draft?
I think that there wasn't really kind of a dominant quarterback. Even Cam Ward, I think in other years probably wouldn't have been viewed as the number 1. I think in general, some teams are kind of riding with the guys that they have. I think when you watch the draft and you look at the teams coming up, you're like, okay, you just kind of go down the list. Arizona's coming up. Well, they've got Kyler Murray. They're not going to use a high draft pick for a quarterback. So on and so forth, right? So like when it would get to teams like the Steelers, everybody was like, okay, are they going to take a quarterback here? Because, they don't have a true, right, number 1 quarterback right now, so to speak. But, they use that capital to do other things with it. So I think the value of the quarterbacks is there. But I also think that, nowadays the lifespan of a quarterback is so short. Unless you feel someone's really going to be a guy who could be your franchise quarterback, it's not worth investing that much of your draft capital in them, because we talked a little bit before we went on the air here. Look at the Titans. They had Tannehill. They got Malik Willis. To kind of come in and be the heir apparent there. That obviously didn't work out. They got a guy who dropped into the second round, and Will Levis. Thought that he could potentially be the guy, and here we are drafting Cam Ward. And this is all in a 5-year span. They've spent a lot of this very early draft capital on quarterbacks, and up to this point it hasn't worked out. So you've got to, if you're the Titans, you gotta really hope that Cam Ward is the guy. I honestly thought if I was the Titans and I didn't love Cam Ward, I would have maybe tried to move out of that pick. But, I think there's a lot of good signs about Cam Ward. I was impressed with a lot of the things he did over the last year. But, it's a question mark. But I think when you look at some of the other quarterbacks and the fact that they went so late, I think it just, unless teams feel they're a franchise quarterback, they're pushing them later and later. And I think that's why some of the guys I think that got drafted in the later rounds, I think at some point we're going to see some of those guys as starters in the NFL, or at least being given an opportunity. I think Quinn Ayers, is a good example. 7th round from the Dolphins. He's a guy who could have gotten, more money to stay in college through the NIL than he got on his rookie deal. But I think, he's got potential to, see some time as a starting quarterback in the NFL. So when you talk about value, getting him in the 7th round, I thought that was something that has tremendous value. So it's kind of feast or famine with quarterbacks. They either view you as a franchise quarterback and are going to spend a lot of their draft capital to get you, or they're going to put you in the higher pick and just kind of, as somebody we have in our quarterback room that has the potential to potentially, come on and do something for us at a later time frame.
Yeah. It seems it's either top heavy for the best guys, and then there's a big drop off, and now you're going to be a later round developmental guy. Yep. We certainly saw that in this draft. All right, before I get you out of here, I got to ask you, the Shedeur Sanders drama. There's been a million things talked about. I did an episode yesterday on it, but at the end of the day, for you, what do you think that was really about?
I mean, I think it goes back to something that you could probably relate to, being a coach, right? In high school. It's, it seems to me like the parental involvement, right? Like at a certain point, Dion's been able to kind of have control over this guy's career for so long, right? And now there's even reports, and again, these are reports, you never know what's true and what's not, that he's asking to be involved in some of these initial meetings with the Browns. And I think that the reality of it is that teams feel that they can't really, work with the guy if there's this kind of notion that, it's working with him and working with Dion. And, I think that to me, I think teams were just kind of probably didn't view him as a franchise quarterback as he thought he was. And I think they thought about the ramifications of, what would come along with that. And I think that predicated his drop. And obviously the Browns at that point, they had already taken Dylan Gabriel in the third round, which was probably a reach. And they were probably like, well, what do we quote unquote have to lose taking him in the fifth? There was reports that the Eagles were going to take him there in the fifth, which frankly wouldn't have been, an awful idea. But I think it's just the notion of what else comes along with him. And I think unfortunately for him, those aspects outweighed probably his ability. And hopefully he for him, I hope he can prove that those that kind of reputation that preceded him is wrong. But in the short term here, it seems like it was right. And hey, I've got a question for you. So let me what would you do to Aiden if he got on your computer and found us numbers for your players and pranked them? How would you handle that?
Oh my God, that I don't the embarrassment of that as a coach, as a public figure. I don't even know how to answer that question. I would like to think that I will have raised a son who would understand the gravity of that and would not do that. That's what I would like to believe. So I don't even know how I would answer that question. That is
I'm a guy who enjoys pranks, but I think when you're looking at something like that situation, I just think there's times that things are funny, and I think there's times that things are just disrespectful. And I think that the fact, first of all, right, he did it. And then, he just couldn't live with the fact that he wasn't going to get recognition for living with it. He had to post it. So, it was like, hey, I got this guy, that was pretty good. I'm just going to let I know and my buddies know I did this. But no, he had to let everybody know. And it is an embarrassment for his father. And it's an embarrassment to the Falcons that this happened. And I mean, again, I think, for Shador, it was kind of like, really kind of kicking somebody when they were down. It's
yeah.
clear the guy was, the guy's very disappointed in what's going on, as a human, you got to kind of feel for the guy a little bit. I'm sure some people are going to be like, oh, he deserved this. This is what you get for doing all those things. But to see guys slide like that and then have somebody prank you like that, I mean, is just, and then to find out it's directly connected to an NFL coach. I mean, it's across the board. It's a bad look.
I agree. It was classless. I'll tell you what, I'll finish by saying this. If a screenwriter wrote this whole drama and then pitched it to a director in Hollywood, a studio in Hollywood, I think they would reject it and be like, that's too far fetched. That the whole thing feels so over the top that well, I guess we'll have to wait for the movie to come out to really know the full story.
Yeah, I'm curious to see even what happens here in the short term, with all of it. I mean, it's an ongoing kind of saga, but I think yeah, it's just crazy. And just the final point I was gonna make to you, Kevin, best pick I felt in the draft. Overall, I watched a lot of Penn State games. I thought Tyler Warren going 14 to the Colts was a great pick. I think that guy, in my opinion, was one of the best players in the draft. And he's so versatile, a lot of things that he's able to do. Definitely a first round pick. I was hoping that the Eagles, with their tight end situation being a little bit uncertain, we're going to trade up and grab him. But my expectation is that guy's going to be a great player in the NFL for a long time.
I agree. Love that guy. Mismatch nightmare for
Yes.
defenses for sure. Ken, this was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Thanks so much for doing this.
Anytime, man. Anytime. Feel free to call me anytime, my friend. I'm happy to come on.
Absolutely. Even you, and we'll get Pez back on here, right, man?
I'd love it.
Yeah, absolutely. I know Pez has been red hot lately with his picks, so that's
That's right, man. He's been on fire. He was even made some good calls on the draft. You know, he
yeah,
talked about Shador dropping. He talks about a lot of things, and it wasn't even personal with Shador, even though he said he dislikes him. So
yeah. No, it's all
it's
business. All business.
all business. That's
Yeah,
all he's focused on.
right. All right. So for Ken Wisnefski, this is Coach Kevin Smith. Join me tomorrow for my Whiteboard Wednesday segment where we're talking scheme and breaking down the great game of football from an X and O perspective. So until then, have a great Tuesday, everybody. Catch you tomorrow.